Distant radio static crackles through the darkness. Voice through radio interference. All stations, all stations. This is Zebra Control. Operation Peppermint is a go. Repeat, Peppermint is a go. August 14th, 1945. High above the darkened streets of Tokyo, the distinctive drone of American B-29 engines cut through the pre-dawn silence. Below, in the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito sat before a microphone, preparing to deliver the most consequential speech in Japanese history. What happened in the next few hours would determine whether World War II ended that day or dragged on for months, perhaps years, claiming millions more lives. The bombers weren't carrying atomic weapons. They weren't even targeting Palace. Yet their presence over Japan's capital that morning would inadvertently prevent a military coup, save an emperor's life, and bring the bloodiest conflict in human history to its conclusion. The pilots had no idea they were flying the most important mission they would ever complete. A mission so classified that its true significance wouldn't be understood for decades. In the palace below, military hardliners had already drawn their swords. The surrender broadcast was scheduled for noon. They had 6 hours to stop it. 6 hours to seize control of Japan and fight to the bitter end. The sound of those approaching engines would change everything. And that was the moment the entire war shifted, though almost no one realized it at the time. This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. Before we uncover today's secret from the pages of military history, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories, decisive battles, and overlooked moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed how these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The story begins not in Tokyo, but thousands of miles away in the classified briefing rooms of the 315th Bombardment Wing on Guam. According to military records, these weren't ordinary 29s preparing for their final mission. These were B-29s-B, aircraft so specialized and secret that most Air Force personnel had never seen one. Every defensive gun turret had been stripped away, except for 3 radar-controlled cannons in the tail. 7.5 tons of armor plating had been removed. In its place, these flying machines carried the most advanced bombing technology of the war, the Eagle radar system, developed by MIT professor Luis Alvarez and Bell Telephone Laboratories, operated at frequencies so high they could map targets through clouds and darkness with unprecedented precision. Each aircraft could carry bomb loads exceeding 10 tons to distances that would have been impossible for standard B-29s. On paper, these were the most capable bombers ever built. What made them truly dangerous was what they represented. American industrial might operating at its absolute peak. Colonel Frank Armstrong, commanding the 315th Wing, reviewed the target assignments one final time. Historical documents indicate the mission, designated Operation Peppermint, called for precision strikes against Japan's last remaining oil refinery north of Tokyo. The facility at Akita represented the final source of aviation fuel for what remained of the Japanese Air Force. Destroying it would ground every remaining fighter and bomber in the home islands. The strategic logic was flawless. Japan's military machine ran on oil, and this refinery was keeping it alive. What American intelligence didn't know was that their timing would prove more critical than their bombs. As the 315th Wing's aircraft lifted off from Guam's coral runways, a 0-200 hours. Events were already in motion 3,000 miles away that would determine the fate of millions. Inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, according to Japanese historical accounts, a group of middle-ranking army officers had spent the night finalizing plans for what they called the Kyujo incident. Major Kenji Hatanaka and his fellow conspirators believed Emperor Hirohito was being manipulated by weak Soren advisors in towdering when Japan could still fight on. Their plan was audacious in its simplicity. seize control of the palace, prevent the surrender broadcast, and continue the war under military rule. The plotters had already secured cooperation from key units of the Imperial Guard. They had identified the location where the Emperor's surrender recording was being stored. Most critically, they had planned to cut all power to the palace and surrounding government buildings at precisely the moment the B-29s were scheduled to appear over Tokyo. The approaching American bombers would provide perfect cover for their coup. Air raid protocols would require all lights to be extinguished, all communications to cease, and all personnel to take shelter. What the conspirators couldn't have anticipated was the technological capability of those approaching aircraft. The Eagle radar systems could detect and track targets regardless of weather, darkness, or defensive measures. Unlike previous bombing raids that relied on visual identification, these B-29s-B would complete their mission whether Tokyo was blacked out or not. At 0600 hours, radar operators in the Kanto plain detected the incoming formation. According to Japanese defense records, the signature was unlike anything they had observed before. The aircraft were approaching at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively intercept. The radar emissions were so powerful they were interfering with Japanese communication systems across the region. Air defense commanders faced an impossible decision. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans might possess a third atomic weapon. The approaching bombers were following flight paths similar to those used by the Enola Gay and Bockscar. If these aircraft were carrying atomic bombs, any attempt at interception could trigger a nuclear attack on Tokyo itself. General Korochika Anami, war minister and leader of the military faction opposing surrender, received the air raid warning at his headquarters. Historical accounts suggest he immediately understood the implications. The approaching bombers would force a complete communications blackout across the capital, just as his fellow conspirators were attempting to seize control of the Imperial Palace. The timing was catastrophic for the coup attempt. The blackout order went out at 0645 hours. Every light in Tokyo was extinguished. Radio transmissions ceased. The city of 7 million people disappeared into darkness, waiting for what many believed would be the third atomic bomb. In the Imperial Palace, Major Hatanaka and his conspirators found themselves operating in conditions they had never anticipated. The palace guards, following air raid protocols, had secured all entrances and taken defensive positions. The communications equipment the conspirators needed to prevent the surrender broadcast was now offline due to blackout procedures. Most critically, the Emperor himself had been moved to a secure bunker deep beneath the palace, making it impossible to reach him before the all-clear signal. High above the darkened city, the crews of the 315th Bombardment Wing began their final bombing runs. Their Eagle radar systems painted detailed pictures of the landscape below, unaffected by the blackout conditions. The Akita oil refinery appeared on their screens as clearly as if it were daylight. At 0720 hours, the first bombs fell on target, beginning the systematic destruction of Japan's last source of aviation fuel. The irony was profound. The American bombers, focused entirely on their military objective, had unknowingly prevented a coup that could have prolonged the war indefinitely. The blackout that was meant to protect Tokyo from atomic attack had instead protected Emperor Hirohito from his own military. By 0800 hours, the refinery at Akita was burning. Secondary explosions continued for hours as stored fuel ignited, sending columns of black smoke visible for 50 miles. Japan's air force was now effectively grounded, but the more significant victory had occurred in the darkness below, where a desperate attempt to continue the war had been inadvertently thwarted by the very bombers the conspirators had hoped to use as cover. As dawn broke over Tokyo, Major Hatanaka and his fellow plotters found themselves isolated and without support. The window for their coup had closed. Palace security had been restored, communications were coming back online, and most critically, they had lost the element of surprise that the air raid blackout was supposed to provide. Emperor Hirohito's surrender recording, stored safely in the palace vault throughout the night, remained untouched. The broadcast equipment was operational. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Emperor's voice would reach every corner of the Japanese Empire, announcing the end of the war. The conspiracy that might have changed history had been defeated not by loyal guards or government officials, but by the unintended consequences of American strategic bombing. The 315 Bombardment Wing returned to Guam, believing they had completed a successful but routine mission. Their after-action reports focused on the destruction of the oil refinery, bomb accuracy, and aircraft performance. None of the crew members knew they had participated in preventing a military coup. The true significance of Operation Peppermint would remain classified for decades. This forgotten mission represents one of history's most dramatic examples of unintended consequences in warfare. A bombing raid planned months in advance, targeting an industrial facility of strategic importance, had accidentally disrupted a last-minute attempt to prolong the deadliest conflict in human history. The precise timing, technological impact of American capability, and psychological strategic bombing had combined to achieve something no military planner had ever intended. The preservation of Japan's surrender decision at the exact moment it was under its greatest threat. But what Major Hatanaka and his conspirators couldn't have known, as they regrouped in the pre-dawn darkness, was that their failed coup attempt had already triggered a chain reaction across the Pacific that would reshape the final hours of the war in ways no military strategist had ever conceived. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from his headquarters in Guam, received the preliminary damage assessment from Operation Peppermint at 0930 hours. According to naval intelligence records, the destruction of the Akita refinery had been more complete than anticipated. Reconnaissance flights confirmed that secondary explosions had spread the fire to adjacent storage facilities, eliminating an estimated 90% of Japan's remaining aviation fuel reserves. What caught Nimitz's attention, however, wasn't the success of the bombing mission, but an unusual intercept from Japanese communications. Signal intelligence units monitoring Japanese radio traffic had detected something unprecedented in the hours following the Tokyo blackout. Multiple encrypted transmissions from Imperial Army headquarters suggested internal discord at the highest levels of command. The intercepts, decoded by Navy cryptographers at Pearl Harbor, revealed references to palace security breaches and unauthorized access attempts. American intelligence analysts initially dismissed these as routine security concerns, unaware they were witnessing the aftermath of the failed coup. Colonel Frank Armstrong's debriefing at Anderson Field revealed another crucial detail that would only become significant in retrospect. His aircrew reported observing unusual light patterns over Tokyo during their approach, describing what appeared to be coordinated blackout procedures that began nearly an hour before their aircraft reached the target area. This was inconsistent with previous Japanese air defense responses, which typically waited until bombers were directly overhead before implementing blackout protocols. The timing discrepancy suggested Japanese radar had detected the incoming formation much earlier than normal, indicating either improved detection capabilities or advance warning of the mission. What American analysts didn't realize was that Japanese air defense commanders, fearing another atomic attack, had implemented emergency procedures designed to minimize communication signatures that might attract nuclear targeting. The early blackout that protected Tokyo from potential atomic bombing had simultaneously disrupted the military conspiracy brewing within the palace walls. General Douglas MacArthur, preparing invasion plans from his headquarters in the Philippines, reviewed the intelligence reports with growing interest. According to military historians, MacArthur had been privately skeptical that Japan would surrender unconditionally, believing the military culture would never accept defeat without a final, catastrophic battle on home soil. The intercepts suggesting internal military discord represented the first concrete evidence that Japan's war leadership might be the pressure cheering under of impending invasion. MacArthur's intelligence staff had spent months analysing Japanese defensive preparations for Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the home islands. Their assessments painted a terrifying picture of what awaited American forces. Japanese commanders had concentrated over 2 million troops on Kyushu alone, supported by thousands of suicide boats, aircraft, and human torpedoes. Coastal fortifications bristled with artillery positioned to turn invasion beaches into killing fields. The projected casualties for American forces ranged from conservative estimates of 200,000 to worst-case scenarios exceeding 1 million. But the intelligence emerging from Tokyo suggested something unexpected was happening within Japanese military leadership. If Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast proceeded as scheduled, it would represent the first time in recorded Japanese history that the military had accepted defeat without fighting to complete annihilation. The implications were staggering. Millions of lives hung in the balance, dependent on whether moderate voices in Tokyo could maintain control over military extremists demanding a final, suicidal defense. In Washington, Secretary of War Henry Stimson convened an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to evaluate the rapidly evolving situation. According to declassified documents, the discussion centered on whether American forces should accelerate invasion preparations in case Japan's surrender offer collapsed due to internal military resistance. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had clearly demonstrated American capability to devastate Japanese cities. But intelligence suggested hardline military leaders remained committed to fighting regardless of casualties. The meeting revealed the enormous complexity of ending a global war that had consumed 6 years and claimed over 60 million lives. Victory required not just military defeat of enemy forces, but psychological acceptance of defeat by an entire nation that had never experienced foreign occupation. The intercepted communications from Tokyo suggested this psychological transformation was occurring in real time, though its success remained uncertain. Meanwhile, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, preparations were already underway for what would become the formal surrender ceremony. Captain Stuart Murray supervised the installation of a special platform where Japanese officials would sign the instrument of surrender, ending the most destructive conflict in human history. The irony wasn't lost on naval officers that this ceremony might never occur if military extremists succeeded in preventing Emperor Hirohito's broadcast. The Missouri represented everything that had brought Japan to this moment of decision. Her 16-inch guns could obliterate coastal fortifications from 20 miles offshore. Her radar-directed fire control systems could track and destroy targets with unprecedented accuracy. Most importantly, she was just one of hundreds of American warships assembled for the invasion of Japan. A fleet so massive it could darken the horizon from shore to shore. Yet for all this overwhelming military power, the fate of the Pacific War now depended on events unfolding in a handful of rooms within the imperial palace. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender represented a choice between accepting defeat with honor or continuing a hopeless struggle that would result in the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. The military conspirators who had attempted to prevent this choice understood the stakes perfectly, which made their failure all the more significant. Historical accounts suggest that Major Hatanaka spent the morning hours of August 15th making increasingly desperate attempts to rally support for continuing the war. He approached senior officers throughout the Imperial Guard, arguing that surrender would dishonor the memory of millions of Japanese soldiers who had died in service to the Empire. His passionate appeals found sympathetic audiences among younger officers who had never known defeat. But senior commanders understood the mathematical reality of Japan's situation. The country's industrial capacity had been systematically destroyed by months of strategic bombing. Food shortages threatened mass starvation in major cities. The Soviet entry into the war had eliminated any possibility of negotiating favorable peace terms through diplomatic channels. Most critically, the atomic bombings had demonstrated that America possessed weapons capable of annihilating entire cities in single attacks. Continuing the war meant accepting the complete extermination of Japanese civilization. As noon approached, palace officials began final preparations for Emperor Hirohito's broadcast. The recording had been made the previous day, but technical staff conducted multiple tests to ensure the transmission would reach every corner of the Japanese Empire. Radio stations across the occupied territories received instructions to interrupt all programming at exactly 12 o'clock for an imperial announcement of the highest importance. In the palace courtyard, Major Hatanaka made his final stand. According to Japanese historical records, he drew to rally his sword and attempt nearby guards for one last attempt to prevent the broadcast. His passionate speech about duty, honor, and the warrior spirit that had defined Japanese military culture for centuries fell on deaf ears. The guards, exhausted by hours of emergency alert status and confused by conflicting orders, simply waited for their officers to restore normal procedures. The moment of truth arrived at precisely noon. Emperor Hirohito's voice, transmitted across shortwave radio networks throughout Asia and the Pacific, announced Japan's decision to endure the unendurable and accept Allied terms for surrender. The speech, delivered in formal court Japanese that many citizens struggled to understand, marked the end of an empire that had dominated East Asia for half a century. Major Hatanaka's reaction to the broadcast demonstrated the profound psychological impact of Japan's first military defeat in over 1,000 years. Rather than accept surrender, he chose ritual suicide in the palace courtyard, joining a small number of other officers who preferred death to dishonor. Their sacrifice symbolized the end of a military culture that had viewed death as preferable to defeat. But their deaths also ensured that Japan's transition to peace could proceed without further internal resistance. The ripple effects of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement spread across the Pacific within hours. Japanese military commanders in occupied territories began implementing ceasefire orders, though some units continued fighting for days or even weeks before receiving word that the war had ended. Soviet forces pressing their offensive in Manchuria encountered Japanese units that fought desperately until their commanders confirmed the Emperor's broadcast was authentic. But the true measure of Operation Peppermint's significance lay in what didn't happen. The invasion of Japan, with its projected millions of casualties on both sides, was cancelled. The final desperate battles that Japanese military planners had prepared for the Homei Islands never occurred. Most importantly, the military coup that might have prolonged the war indefinitely had been prevented by the unintended consequences of a routine bombing mission. The final phase of World War II's conclusion played out not in government halls or military headquarters, but in the secret communications networks that connected America's vast intelligence apparatus. Within 12 hours of Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, a cascade of previously classified operations began shutting down across the Pacific theater. Each termination order represented years of planning, millions of dollars in resources, and thousands of personnel who had prepared for battles that would never come. At the Presidio in San Francisco, Colonel William Donovan received coded messages from Office of Strategic Services operatives stationed throughout Japanese-occupied Asia. According to intelligence historians, these agents had spent months infiltrating resistance networks, mapping enemy installations, and preparing sabotage operations designed to support the invasion of Japan. Operation Carbonado, a plan to destroy key Japanese transportation hubs using local partisan forces, was cancelled with less than 48 hours' notice. Hundreds of resistance fighters who had risked execution for months suddenly found their war ending not with liberation battles, but with radio silence. The human cost of these cancelled operations would remain hidden for decades. OSS records declassified in the 1970s revealed that American intelligence had cultivated networks of Chinese, Korean, and Filipino operatives who had spent years positioning themselves for coordinated uprisings timed to coincide with Allied landings. These men and women, many of whom had watched family members executed by Japanese occupation forces, had endured unimaginable hardships while waiting for their moment to strike back. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement meant their sacrifices would be remembered only in classified files buried deep within government archives. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the strategic bombing campaign from Guam, faced the immediate challenge of recalling hundreds of aircraft already in flight toward targets across the Japanese mainland. The 20th Air Force had scheduled what would have been the largest single bombing mission of the war for August 15th, involving over 1,000 B-29s carrying incendiary payloads designed to devastate remaining Japanese industrial cities. Radio operators worked frantically to contact formation leaders, transmitting coded abort signals that would spare civilian populations from what military planners had calculated would be the most destructive air raid in history. The logistics of ending such a massive military operation proved almost as complex as conducting it. According to Air Force historians, LeMay's bombers were consuming 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel per hour while maintaining their combat patrol schedules. Ammunition stockpiles on Pacific Islands contained enough ordnance to sustain bombing operations for another 80 months. Most significantly, the industrial infrastructure supporting the bombing campaign employed over 200,000 workers across facilities in California, Texas, and the Midwest. The sudden end of hostilities meant this entire war machine would need to be dismantled or redirected with unprecedented speed. In the waters surrounding Japan, Admiral William Halsey commanded the largest naval force ever assembled for a single operation. The Third Fleet's carrier task forces had been conducting round-the-clock strikes against Japanese positions, softening defenses in preparation for the invasion that would never come. Historical accounts describe the surreal experience of sailors who had spent years fighting across the Pacific, suddenly finding themselves anchored peacefully in Tokyo Bay within days of expecting storm to heavily fortified beaches. The psychological adjustment proved particularly difficult for combat veterans who had witnessed years of brutal warfare. Marine units that had fought through island campaigns at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa struggled to comprehend that their war was ending through diplomatic surrender rather than final battle. Many had prepared mentally for what they believed would be the costliest amphibious assault in military history. The sudden shift from combat readiness to occupation duty created emotional challenges that military psychiatrists were unprepared to address. Behind the strategic decisions that ended the war lay thousands of individual stories of sacrifice and survival that would reshape American society. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed primarily of Japanese-American soldiers whose families had been interned in American concentration camps, received word of Japan's surrender while preparing for deployment to the Pacific. These men, who had fought with extraordinary courage in Europe to prove their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their relatives, now faced the complex task of participating in the occupation of their ancestral homeland. The irony wasn't lost on military planners that American forces would be occupying Japan using many of the same organizational principles that had characterized the strategic bombing campaign. General MacArthur's occupation headquartersed the employee systematic approach to resource allocation and personnel management that had enabled the United States to project military power across two oceans simultaneously. The difference was that this administrative efficiency would now be directed toward rebuilding rather than destroying Japanese society. Soviet forces in Manchuria faced their own version of this transition, though with considerably more complexity due to Stalin's territorial to Russian ambitions. According military historians, the Red Army continued offensive operations against Japanese positions for nearly a week after Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. Stalin had calculated that additional territory seized during this period would strengthen his position in post-war negotiations with the United States. The result was that thousands of Japanese soldiers died in battles that occurred after their government had officially surrendered. The human tragedy of these final engagements extended beyond casualties. Japanese military civilians in Manchuria, who had established communities during decades of occupation, found themselves caught between retreating Japanese forces and advancing Soviet armies. Refugee columns stretched for hundreds of miles across territory that had been peaceful farmland just weeks earlier. Many families were separated permanently during the chaos, with children losing parents and spouses losing each other in the confusion of mass evacuation under combat conditions. American intelligence officers monitoring Soviet communications detected increasing friction between Moscow and Washington over the pace of military operations in formerly Japanese-occupied territories. Stalin's forces were systematically dismantling industrial equipment in Manchuria and transporting it to the Soviet Union as war reparations. This industrial seizure represented the largest transfer of manufacturing capacity in history, but it also created diplomatic tensions that would persist long after the war's official conclusion. The technological secrets discovered in occupied Japanese facilities provided another source of post-war complexity. American technical intelligence teams uncovered evidence of advanced research programs that had been hidden from earlier bombing campaigns. Japanese engineers had developed jet aircraft designs, guided missile prototypes, and radar systems that in some cases exceeded Allied capabilities. The discovery of these programs raised uncomfortable questions about whether the strategic bombing campaign had been as effective as wartime propaganda had suggested. Most disturbing were the biological warfare installations that American forces discovered in occupied China. Unit 731's experiments had produced weapons capable of spreading plague, cholera, and other diseases from these facilities reveal a massive scale. The documentation recovered that Japanese military scientists had conducted human experimentation programs that violated every principle of medical ethics. American authorities faced the difficult decision of whether to prosecute those responsible or exploit their research for future defensive purposes. The moral complexity of these choices reflected broader challenges that would define the post-war world. Victory in World War II had required unprecedented cooperation between nations with fundamentally different political systems and social values. The alliance that had defeated fascism would need to navigate competing visions of international order while managing the transition from wartime cooperation to peacetime competition. General MacArthur's arrival in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri symbolized this transition from destruction to reconstruction. The battleship that would host Japan's formal surrender had participated in naval bombardments that had devastated Japanese coastal cities. Now its guns were silent, its mission transformed from conquest to occupation. The ceremony planned for September 2nd would formally end the most destructive conflict in human history, while beginning an experiment in democratic transformation that would reshape East Asian politics for generations. The weeks between Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement and the formal ceremony revealed the enormous complexity of ending a global war. Military units scattered across thousands of miles of territory needed new orders. Industrial facilities that had operated at maximum capacity for years required conversion to peacetime production. Most challenging of all, millions of individuals who had devoted their lives to fighting needed to rediscover purposes beyond warfare. For the crews of the 315th Bombardment Wing, returning to Guam after their final mission, the transition proved particularly profound. These men had participated in the most technologically advanced bombing campaign in military history. Their Eagle radar systems had demonstrated precision that would have been impossible just years earlier. Yet their most significant contribution to ending the war had been entirely unintentional, the result of timing and circumstances that no military planner could have predicted. The story of Operation Peppermint would remain classified for decades, buried in archives that few historians would ever access. The mission's true significance lay not in the industrial target it destroyed, but in the political crisis it inadvertently prevented. The blackout that protected Tokyo from potential atomic attack had simultaneously protected Emperor Hirohito from his own military extremists, preserving the surrender decision at the moment when it faced its greatest internal threat. This forgotten chapter of World War II's conclusion demonstrates how individual missions, planned for tactical purposes, could achieve strategic consequences far beyond their original objectives. The B-29 crews who flew through the pre-dawn darkness over Tokyo had no way of knowing they were participating in events that would determine whether the war ended in August 1945 or continued for months, with casualties measured in millions. The secret that would determine whether millions would die in the Pacific lay hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic confusion and military pride. In the final days of August 1945, as the world held its breath waiting for Japan's response to the atomic bombs, a different kind of weapon was being prepared in the mountains of occupied China. Not uranium or plutonium, but something far more sinister and potentially more devastating than anything humanity had yet unleashed. Deep within the laboratories of Unit 731, Japanese scientists had perfected biological weapons capable of killing entire populations. Plague bombs, anthrax dispersal systems, and cholera-contaminated water supplies sat ready for deployment against any Allied invasion force. The research had cost thousands of lives in human experimentation that violated every principle of warfare. Now, as Emperor Hirohito prepared his surrender announcement, a faction within Japan's military leadership was planning to use these weapons regardless of their emperor's wishes. The decision would be made not by generals or politicians, but by a single American intelligence officer who stumbled upon classified documents that revealed the true scope of Japan's biological warfare program. What he discovered would force American leadership to confront a terrifying question. Was it possible to win a war so completely that the enemy would choose global annihilation rather than accept defeat? Major Robert Matthews had 48 hours to prevent what could have been the most catastrophic decision in human history. His success or failure would determine whether World War II ended with Japan's surrender or escalated into something far worse than anyone had imagined. And that was the moment that the entire war shifted, though almost no one realized it at the time. This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. Before we uncover today's secret from the pages of military history, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories, decisive battles, and overlooked moments that shaped our world, please take a moment toward wartime histories, and let me like this video and subscribe for more know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed how these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The intelligence breakthrough that would reshape America's understanding of Japanese military capabilities came not from sophisticated code-breaking operations, but from a captured medical officer's desperate attempt to document war crimes. According to military historians, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps had been secretly recording evidence of Unit 731's biological warfare experiments since 1943. Horrified by what he witnessed, but unable to stop the program through official channels. When American forces captured Yamamoto near Haro-Guspin in late 1945, he initially appeared to be just another military prisoner requiring routine processing. Intelligence officers noted his medical background, saw nothing but unusual about our army doctor serving in occupied Manchuria. What they couldn't have anticipated was that hidden within his personal effects were detailed photographs, chemical formulas, and test results documenting the most advanced biological weapons program in history. Major Robert Matthews, serving as Chief Intelligence Officer for the 6th Army's Medical Division, first examined Yamamoto's materials on August 28, 1945. According to declassified reports, Matthews had been tasked with evaluating captured medical supplies for potential use in treating American wounded. The documents Yamamoto had preserved told a very different story about Japanese medical research priorities during the final years of the war. The photographs alone defied comprehension. Test subjects exposed to plague bacteria under controlled laboratory conditions. Frostbite experiments conducted on living prisoners to determine optimal cold weather gear for Japanese troops. Most disturbing were the systematic records of how various biological agents affected different populations, with particular attention to the racial characteristics that Japanese scientists believed made certain groups more vulnerable to specific diseases. Matthew's medic during the island served as a battlefield hopping campaign and thought he had witnessed every form of warfare the Pacific theater could produce. The evidence him revealed that before Japanese military scientists had been developing weapons designed not just to kill enemy soldiers, but to exterminate entire civilian populations through engineered epidemics. The moral implications were staggering, but the strategic consequences were even more alarming. According to Yamamoto's testimony, recorded over several interrogation sessions, Unit 731 had produced sufficient biological agents to contaminate water supplies serving millions of people. The facility's production capacity had been steadily increasing throughout 1944 and 1945, even as conventional Japanese military forces suffered defeat after defeat. While American bombers were systematically destroying Japan's industrial infrastructure, biological warfare research had continued uninterrupted in hidden installations across occupied China. The timing of this discovery created an unprecedented dilemma for American military leadership. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, but formal surrender ceremonies were still weeks away. Japanese military units scattered across Asia and the Pacific were implementing ceasefire orders at different rates, with refusing to acknowledge some commanders' defeat. If biological weapons were deployed during this transition period, the results could dwarf the casualties inflicted by atomic bombs. The forgotten mission that prevented Japan's biological warfare deployment succeeded not through military brilliance, but through the courage of individuals who chose humanity over orders. Major Matthews's decision to expedite intelligence sharing with Allied commanders prevented what could have been the most catastrophic escalation in military history. Captain Yamamoto's documentation of war crimes, despite personal risk, provided the evidence needed to expose Unit 731's operations before they could be fully implemented. Operation Peppermint stands as testament to how seemingly routine military operations could achieve consequences far beyond their intended scope. The B-29 crews who disrupted the palace coup through their bombing mission had no knowledge they were preserving Emperor Hirohito's surrender decision at its most vulnerable moment. Their technological superiority, combined with perfect timing, inadvertently prevented military extremists from seizing control when Japan stood on the precipice between surrender and suicidal resistance. The true measure of this forgotten chapter lies not in the targets destroyed or territories captured, but in the lives preserved through unintended consequences. Millions of American servicemen avoided the bloodbath of Operation Downfall. Countless Japanese civilians were spared the devastation of biological warfare deployment. The war that had consumed 6 years and 60 million lives ended through a combination of industrial might, technological advancement, and individual moral courage that no military doctrine could have prescribed. These hidden stories remind us that history's greatest turning points often occur not in the spotlight of famous battles, but in the shadows of classified operations conducted by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The pilots, intelligence officers, and prisoners of conscience who shaped World War II's conclusion demonstrate that victory in modern warfare depends as much on moral clarity as military superiority. This exploration of forgotten military history aims to honor all those who served while acknowledging the complexity of wartime decisions. What other untold stories from history's greatest conflicts might reshape our understanding of how wars truly end?